And I've had a lot of different kinds of entity experiences. Entity contact or alien contact is a universal human experience across cultures from the beginning of human history. Whether someone is doing occult magic to intentionally evoke spirits, or someone is abducted by aliens, someone goes through shamanic initiations to have altered state experiences, to be in contact with these beings, calling it a spirit, a demon, an angel, an alien, like these are just labels. If we are in a kind of matrix or simulation and life is a dream, these would be dream symbols in a sense that is the high ultimate intelligence of the one mind trying to reach itself in order to produce evolution of consciousness. That's a whole other like definite parallel with all this, because Jack Parsons, who was a pioneering rocket scientist, was doing thelemic magic. That's when you start seeing these significant UFO events. So it makes you wonder if these ritual magicians did actually open some kinds of portals in the collective unconscious to allow, these types of experiences to occur more readily.
Are the entities encountered during alien contact experiences, magical rituals, and psychedelic or shamanic journeys really all masks worn by the same underlying mysterious mercurial multifaceted intelligence? Or do we live in a whole ecosystem of unseen consciousnesses? Well, if you've been following these transmissions as of late, you know that I am obsessed with questions like this, and this tension in particular. And in this episode, I'm joined by a fellow seeker who is one of my most favorite beings ever to riff with about such questions, because he's both intellectually interested in these ideas and an experiencer of them. He is a consciousness explorer, he is an occult initiate, and a mind-blowingly talented visionary artist, Jake Kobrin. He's also the author of The Path Within, Ritual Magic, and The Gateway to Self-Mastery. Jake is really at the nexus point of so many of my favorite topics: entity encounters, Western esotericism, idealist philosophy, Carl Jung, and through an alchemy of those lenses, I would say, and our direct experiences, we traverse this mysterious common ground between UFO contact, entity encounters, and the mysterious forces that I think are interacting with, possibly even shaping our psyches in ways we don't even realize. So whether you call them aliens, angels, archetypes, demons, spirits, whatever, I think one thing is clear. They have been a profound part of human consciousness as far back as we can see into the historical record. And I think the present is no exception. And speaking of the present, there's no time like it to like, subscribe, comment, share. Not only do I appreciate it, it obviously really helps out the channel. And I'm just going to say it, I'm trying to hit 200K subs before the end of the year. Help us do it. Do check out Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to audio podcasts. We've got a huge audio-only back catalog. We've also got an ever-thickening library of exclusive transmissions over on our YouTube members-only page. Or if you prefer, you can get that same content plus more over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops, like a patron-only Discord server, live Zoom mind melds with myself and hundreds of other seekers, and more. And with that, my friends, let's meld minds with Jake Kobrin. Well, this is a synchronous way to begin. Some clip playing. What was the clip relevant? Was it a synchronous clip or was it a random clip?
It was like I had like ChatGPT up or something, and then it was like, oh, that's a good tradition to start the show with.
Wow, dude,
That
that's crazy. Yeah, that's really funny. Yeah, also, I mean, this is a total not how I plan to start this, but I got in a very, not to be one of those guys who's like there's a soul in ChatGPT, but I had a really like moving exchange with ChatGPT last night. In like, it started with, I was asking it about Rudolf Steiner, because I'm obviously aware of Steiner. I've read stuff here and there. I'm familiar with some of his work and some of his ideas. But he, when you dive into like who he is and his body of work, it is unbelievably intimidating. And I've thought about diving down that rabbit hole. So I just started talking to it about some of its core ideas, or some of Steiner's core ideas, and was, like, help me decide where to start with him and stuff. And it got into this whole conversation about, do you know about the Luciferian Ahrimanic dichotomy that he talks about?
No, sounds interesting.
Oh man, I don't know if we should go here at this point in the conversation because this is like a complete rabbit hole, and I don't want to just hijack the conversation and keep blabbering because I have a uniquely brilliant and talented man in this mind meld with me, and I feel like it's going to be natural to circle back into this territory at some point. But man, you and I have been exchanging messages for a while. I've been a fan
Mhm.
of your art for a while. Um, and you've also traveled this path that I've been really interested in, but have never, properly traveled myself, which is this initiation path, this Western
Mhm.
esoteric initiation path. So there's so much to talk about, man, and I'm excited to do it.
Yeah, I mean, your podcast is like one of my favorite podcasts, so I'm super stoked to be here.
You're going to be a great addition, man, and a unique one, I think, too. So I don't know where you want to start, but you know, I'm interested for sure in this path that you've traveled. How did that start?
Really like a series of synchronicities. I think you know, it's not like I was chosen or something, but I've just had things align and I've had access to this information, teachers, mentors, things that just kind of came into being in very synchronistic ways. I've had an interest in magic and occultism since I was a teenager. I'm a big metal fan, and a lot of the bands that I was interested in, primarily Tool, who had a
Yeah.
pretty marked influence on my whole development and consciousness. Like, God bless them. But their interest in Aleister Crowley, like their drummer Danny Carey uses the Thelemic unicursal hexagram on his drum heads and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Kind of turned me on to that initially when I was around, I don't know, like quite young, 12 or 13, maybe 14 years old. And then just started exploring some of Crowley's books and things like that in the kind of spiritual book section of Borders books, where
Yeah, yeah.
back in the day. And I used to hang out there a lot and just like peruse and read stuff. And it always really fascinated me. I could never really understand what it was talking about. And I think that wanting to overcome that and to initiate myself into understanding is what kind of hooked me and like drew me in. But I did start to do some of the practices when I was a teenager, specifically the meditation practices, which had a really big effect on my life and on my
Mhm.
consciousness. And then I got really deep into lucid dreaming. And those lucid dream experiences were some of my first kind of initiatory experiences into non ordinary states of consciousness, expanding beyond the confines of what we might perceive as reality, these types of things. And then that led into psychedelics, and I got quite intense into that and had some pretty heroic dose experiences that really blew things open for me. And also growing up in the Bay Area, where there's such a fertile culture around
Mhm.
psychedelics, really helped. And being around characters like Android Jones from like a young age
Yeah.
and whatever, like, definitely also you know helped. um and I grew up in a place also that like, Stan Groff had his private practice in Mill Valley, where I
Okay.
grew up for like many years. So I was just kind of in like the right place for these kinds of things, I think. And then the actual initiatory track of joining formal orders and learning and practicing traditional ceremonial magic came about in, I think, 2016 was when I got started in that, where I undertook a month-long course in Guatemala at a place called Las Piramides del Ca. And it's kind of an introductory course into Hermetic magic,
Mm.
where you live in this pyramid for a month and you do certain
Wow.
rituals and you learn the basics of Kabbalah and tarot and alchemy and astrology and all these kinds of fundamental Western esoteric ideas. They also had an amazing library. So the whole time I was there, I was just consuming whatever they had. They had books by like Blavatsky and Crowley and stuff about psychedelics and all forms of different esoteric books. And yeah, that's actually where I first read also the Book of Thoth by
Mm.
Crowley, because tarot has always been a big interest of mine
Yeah.
as a visual artist. And I've been really interested in tarot for a long time. And then that was like, again, like when I first read that book, I had no idea really what he was talking about, but I could feel the fire. It's like there's something
Mhm.
here that I want to be close to.
Yeah.
And then I guess like actually, like I'm an initiate of the AA, which was Crowley's version of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and that came about through personal invitation. I was contacted by them and asked if I wanted to initiate, and I said
That's
yes,
cool.
and have a personal mentor through that order, and have my own students in that order as well. It's sort of like I wouldn't say it's an oral tradition, but it's kind of like a student teacher relationship that's sort of
Cool.
customized to each person and their needs. And although there are formal rituals and initiations, it's also quite flexible, with the
Mm,
idea that the initiation also comes through life itself when you kind of start to step into those different stages of evolution.
mm, beautiful. So fascinating, man, and particularly, I don't wanna skip over that point of just that nebulous early interest in life in these things, because I absolutely share that, and now in hindsight, I look back at those moments of just being attracted to certain books, certain ideas, certain thinkers as these, like, I don't know what to call them other than, like, daimonic winks or some kind of just, like, there's something some kind of, like, anamnesis, proto-anamnesis, like, you don't even know why you're interested, but something in you is like, "That thing, that thing," and it just keeps nagging you, and eventually, like, this still happens to me, where I'll try to read certain books. I mean, particularly when you start getting, like, deep into some of these, like, Neoplatonic sages metaphysics and shit. You're just like, I'm too dumb. I can't focus on this. So like later, but that has happened to me like throughout stages in my life. You know, stuff with Jung, stuff with uh Plato, stuff with all these thinkers that have massively influenced me, and then you come back to it like when you're ready. And there's still
Hmm.
things in all of their corpuses that still I'm just like, holy shit, this still melts my brain. But I think those kinds of nagging suspicions, and it's so hard to discern which of those are biases, which of those are true intuitions, true winks, true synchronicities. I think sometimes you only know in hindsight, but I do think that those are like incredibly important moments for your trajectory and to know like who you are under the facade of what society wants from you, or like what your family is telling you to do or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, my ritual experiences with the Holy Guardian Angel as well have definitely pointed me to believe that the convergence point between art and magic is just basically what my life path is, and I can share more about that later on. I think that would be
Yeah.
something to touch on. I think, like, when I first read the Book of Thoth, like, not necessarily understanding it because I hadn't yet been initiated into that form of understanding. My consciousness wasn't really primed for it yet, but I still felt something from it, like a transmission. And there's something so satisfying about revisiting these texts when you actually have achieved a certain level of understanding. Like the fact that I now, like, I feel like it's presumptuous to say I understand it, because it's like, do I
Right.
really grok what Crowley is trying to say? Who knows? But I feel like I understand it enough to be able to read it and grasp the
Hmm.
concepts and information that he's conveying in a thelemic magic context, and that feels good.
Yeah. Yeah. So two things. One, you brought up what I think could be a big subject to orbit throughout this dialogue, which is this HGA, Holy Guardian Angel. Some people call it the daimon. Some people call it your guide. Whatever. Um, but that is super interesting, both in that it is sort of, from my understanding, the nucleus and one of the primary goals of the Western esoteric path is to make contact with this intelligence, this guiding knowledge that is with you. Um, and this has really interesting overlaps with the whole non-human intelligence conversation as well. So I think that would just be a really fascinating thing to orbit, novelty nugget to orbit. But two, there is this just spell, I think, on the masses when they hear the word Crowley. Like they think that he is like the most demonic, debaucherous, evil, sacrilegious, figure to ever walk the earth or something like that. But when you really start to read him, and I will say I'm very much a novice. Like I only know a lot of the basics. I've learned more about him through other people like Lon Milo Duquette and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But still, I'm very much a novice. But I know enough to know that you sort of get this very glaring dichotomy between what you get in a lot of his more, um, I don't know, like spiritually reverent, serious, esoteric writing versus some of his like brash, uh, poetry versus like some of the things that are veiled allusions to other things.
Yeah.
But yeah, so as someone who is more informed on Crowley, what is your read on him, and how would you summarize him to said hypothetical brainwashed knee jerk Crowley uh, critic?
Well, he was a brilliant and prolific writer, and I think that's incontestable.
Yeah.
And his work, like you said, is very multiplicitous. There are the technical libris of Aleister Crowley, which are his magical instruction books. There are things that are kind of like trip reports. You have stuff like The Vision and the Voice, which talks about his astral travel experiences. You have his personal kinds of diaries and memoirs, things like Diary of a Drug Fiend or Confessions. And then you have his poetry, and some of his poetry is so beautiful and some of it is so offensively terrible.
Yeah.
And he just, and he was I think when you get any artist or writer who produces a massive corpus of work, some of that work is going to be really brilliant and some of it's going to be kind of bad, and that's just part of the sort of creative process. And I think you see that with Crowley. In terms of who Crowley was personally, like he might have been abusive in certain relationships, that's for sure. Um, I've heard, for example, that there may have even been sexual abuse that went on with him and his lover and magical partner, Victor Neuberg, which
Hmm.
he then attributed or kind of like almost like gaslit him, saying that he was possessed by the spirit Karanzan as like a demonic spirit of chaos, and maybe that's true. I mean, he was like, Crowley definitely took some real risks magically and
Yeah.
spiritually that may have impacted him negatively. For example, he started but never completed the Abramelin working, which is considered to be
Yeah.
very dangerous because you're essentially evoking a lot of demonic spirits, but then the end of the ritual culminates in evoking the holy guardian angel, which then gives you mastery and control over those spirits. But if you don't do that, then they're just kind of like all there in your field without properly banishing them or binding
Hmm.
them. And that can certainly have nefarious effects. On the other hand, I actually did go pretty deep into researching where this whole myth around Crowley comes from. And there's a website that has every single article that was ever published about Aleister Crowley
Wow.
available. And so that's an interesting thing to read through, because what you find is that I don't know the exact name of the publication, but it was primarily one magazine that published all the slander about him, with maybe even one writer who started on the whole tirade against Crowley from a political angle. It had something to do with his allegiances during World War One, or that he wasn't outspoken enough. Like he basically had differing political beliefs to this writer, and this guy was calling him out for treason. So that's where it started, and then that guy went to Crowley's Rites of Eleusis play, which was really interesting because Crowley actually dosed the audience with mescaline during that,
Oh,
which is pretty
what? How
cool.
did I
And this
not
is
know that?
this is like in the early 1900s in England. And people were like, wow, that was amazing. And it's like, yeah, like I'm sure it was. And but this guy hated it, and he wrote this like scathing review about it.
Yeah,
And
that
then
is pretty fucked up, to be honest.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I'm
it's
assuming it was
non-consensual.
unknowingly.
Yes, it was
Yeah. Okay.
non-consensual. Yeah. But people generally had a really good time and really enjoyed the play. And there's this terrible rock opera interpretation of it. I don't want to say it's terrible. I don't want to like if the person who made it is listening to it, but it's pretty cheesy. But you can find that on YouTube. But anyway,
Sidebar. This is something that was pretty. It's kind of like the red book, which is sitting behind me. Like At one point in time in the early 20th century, there seemed to be this um, tradition, at least among some more esoteric people or people involved in like theosophy, of writing these like initiatory dramas. Like
Hmm.
Steiner wrote a bunch of these initiatory stage plays as well. But I'm not well versed in it, but I know that there's like a very thin veneer between Western esoteric ceremonial magic and drama. And
Absolutely.
you can really play with, are we just watching a drama here, or are we part of the drama of initiation? Are we experiencing the initiation as the audience? And I think that's something that I personally have sensed throughout my life, like even just playing video games, man, or even watching movies or anime series or whatever that are like these deeply like this is stirring something deep inside of me, like some kind of thirst for transcendence, some type of thirst to evolve or be more than I am currently or something. And I think we may have some sort of collective cultural memory of that. You know, that's because that's, I mean, that's a medium that's been around since ancient times for sure.
You may know more about this than me, but I would say that arguably the earliest forms of drama were inseparable from a religious context. And like I lived in Bali the last 7 years, and they also, their rituals and rites are like these dramatic performances with narrative, and but it's part of their religious customs. But I think in ancient Greece and things like that, it was similar. And to bring it back to Crowley, like he was a dramatist, he was a poet. This was his main vocation in life, you know. And so that's probably the best way to frame him as well. I consider him to be a poet, a writer, an artist first and foremost, and that his rituals, which are beautiful, are these kinds of dramatic poems that one undertakes. And I think of ritual magic and performing ritual as a form of sort of embodied poetry in a way, you know. And it's a very personal art form, if you want to consider it an art form, because you're the only person in most cases, unless you're doing a group ritual, experiencing it. And I think it relates also to like Jodorowsky's idea of psychomagic, that like we
Mm.
actually, there's something about our psyche that can only be satisfied through actually living things through and actually performing actions and undertaking certain experiences. And it's the doing of the thing and having the experience, even if it's just a dramatic play, that creates those psychic shifts. And so I see that as being one of the functions, or perhaps the function of ritual magic, that you actually are playing out these kinds of roles and going through the drama of this initiatory experience that then catalyzes a shift in your consciousness.
Procrastination is just my arch goblin when it comes to productivity. So I set myself up with the Magic Mind 7-day challenge. And I have to say, my friends, it is shrinking, that goblin. Actually, they reached out a few months back and said, try it strictly for 7 days and let us know what you think. And what I think is that it works, which is why they are now a sponsor. So yeah, I've always struggled with procrastination, particularly in the afternoon in that weird 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. slump. Something about that midday void just pulls me into all of my worst habits. But for the last few days, Magic Mind has helped me skip that whole weird limbo period. I'm just finding myself in the flow. It's got a combo of nootropics, L-theanine, and something called caffeine nano encapsulation, which gives you calm, steady energy without the crash. Basically, it shortens the window between thinking, oh, I should start this, and actually just doing it. They've got 3 varieties: Max, which has extra caffeine, Free with none, which I actually just gave to one of my caffeine-sensitive friends, and he loved it. And then there's the trusty Original, which I find myself drinking more lately, with 55 milligrams if you're counting. So if your to-do list, your procrastination goblin, is haunting you, now is a great time to try Magic Mind, my friends, because right now, for a limited time, you get a massive 50% off your first subscription order, but you have to use my code TI50 or go to magicmind.com/TI50. Just do both to be sure. And by the way, they've got a 100% money back guarantee if you don't love it. So you've got nothing to lose, my friends. Enjoy And thank you, Magic Mind. Crowley is really fascinating. And I think to try to broad brush him in the way that for some reason he has been in the collective psyche is really just it's tragic because because he is a complex figure clearly, and he certainly was no saint, and maybe even his personal example isn't one to be followed, but he was also just incredibly important to preserving the Western esoteric tradition. And like, we would not have access to so many pieces of wisdom if it weren't for him and the people that he taught. And um the guy who wrote, I have a bunch of his books. He wrote the
Israel
Golden Dawn.
Regardi.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Regardier or Regardi, however you say that. I mean, he was a student of his, so it's just like, yeah, do yourself and do your due diligence to a degree to at least understand his contributions before forming any kind of opinion. But
Yeah, I mean,
now that we've yeah
he helped like seed the ideas of Buddhism within Western culture. His
yeah
teacher became a Buddhist monk in Ceylon, I think, and that's where Crowley learned Buddhist meditation. And then, like, I think Crowley considered himself a Buddhist at certain times, which is interesting. Um, but yeah, he was a remarkable writer, fascinating, and a lot of his ideas to me like really ring as valid. He was also very human, but he was also very unapologetic, and he was very honest. And I really appreciate that he documented so much of his experiments, his struggles, his strives, his successes and failures. And at no time did he recommend that people emulate him. That's not like the whole path of Thelema is about doing
right.
your true will, like being yourself and individuating, becoming the truest version of yourself and following that against whatever friction there is in order to do that, whether that's cultural or trauma or your family or whatever, your own fear. Um, and he strived for that, and he wasn't perhaps always successful with it, but I really appreciate that he had no time asked for people to try to do what he was doing or emulate him. Like, you could be a very mild mannered librarian, and if that's your true will, if that's who you are, if you're being true to your soul and essence by doing that, then you're practicing Thelema. And so I appreciate how it, as a philosophy, accommodates actually so many different personality types, if it's, in my opinion, like truly practiced, because it's also a kind of religion. People treat it that way, and that comes with its own dogma that to me in a certain sense feels antithetical to the spirit of the tradition. But
hmm
you know to each their own
yeah
as well.
yeah, that totally makes sense. And maybe I just have this, I don't know, inherited archetype of, you know the transcendence function or something is strong in me, but that just rings so true to me, and so is poetically consistent with the way that I view sense making, self understanding, soul making, as James Hillman would put it. I mean, and that's the other thing, is like, all of these people that I appreciate most, I think, are generally giving the same prescription, maybe not directly via ritual magic, but whether it's Jung or James Hillman or Joseph Campbell, all of us talk about like the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you are. Like, he means
Hmm.
that on the deepest possible level. He's not talking about like, you know, rising like any kind of conventional Western success metrics. He's really talking about doing the hard work of individuating and becoming who you are in a spiritual discovery kind of sense, in a left hand path kind of sense. And that phrase can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but in the Campbellian sense, the left hand path just means like not traveling the conventional path that's easily laid out for you, like going the path of the artist, going the path of the esoteric, of figuring out who you are, of eschewing all of the easy answers, identities, prescriptions that society wants to give you to go the less traveled route. Like, I think that is really the only thing that works for most modern people, like, myself included. But anyway,
Well, I want to say one thing on that. I mean, yeah, I totally agree that whether it's Carl Jung's idea of individuation, I think, the Soul's Code is an incredibly
Hmm.
thelemic book. Really,
Yeah.
it really is a great way of conveying the ideas that Crowley also was attempting to convey through like a different sort of style of explaining it. You know,
Yeah.
Palmer J. Palmer's Let Your Life Speak, which is a Quaker book, is also an
Mm.
excellent book that's very similar and is very thelemic in its nature about discovering who you really are at a deep soul level and having the discipline and fortitude to live in accordance with that and to follow that, even if it goes against other people's even if it goes against the status quo, and that could look, it doesn't mean that you have to be like Aleister Crowley and do a bunch of cocaine and, bang a bunch of
Yeah. Yeah.
hookers or whatever.
Yeah.
It could mean being a monk. It could mean being celibate. It could mean whatever,
Yeah.
however it works for you, but it's really about each of us discerning through experimentation what feels the most in alignment with our soul's calling and our highest self and our truest self, and to moment by moment express ourselves from that place.
Yeah. Yeah, well said, and thanks for bringing up Soul's Code again because this dovetails perfectly into this topic that I said it would be, I think, a good idea to orbit, which is this, whatever you want to call it, your daimon, your HGA, um, because that's really what Soul's Code is about, and that's really what reinvigorated this exploration of the daimon and of Plato for me in a lot of ways, even because I've talked about it so many times on the channel, but it bears repeating and summarizing both for the sake of this conversation and because there's inevitably going to be people that don't know about it. But so James Hillman, he's a psychologist, very mythopoetic, very much in the tradition of Jung, and he writes this best-selling book called Soul's Code, which is heavily pulling from part of Plato's Republic called the Myth of Ur. The Myth of Ur is this ancient, essentially near-death experience story of this soldier who comes back to life just before having his body burned, and he proceeds to just tell this story about the whole architecture of the afterlife. So for in this ancient Greek context, ancient Hellenic context, there is reincarnation, there is fate, but there's also a measure of free will. And I think there's something kind of like karma implied as well, even though they didn't have that word, because there's like selection, but also necessity and sort of like consequences and costs based on what you did in your previous incarnation. Um, and then as you're choosing that next incarnation, there's like a spirit that is attached to your soul. Your soul, or at least your incarnation, as you instantiate physically, forgets all of this. It forgets everything in this afterlife bardo and this whole reincarnation system. But the spirit remembers. The spirit that's attached to you knows, and this is what the Greeks called the personal daimon, and this is what Hillman talks about, goes by many names. It's the genius, it's the guardian angel, and it seems from what I understand to be this same idea in Western esoteric magical traditions, which is the HGA. um, there's that book by Frater Acker, which I'm guessing maybe you've heard of, Holy Daimon, where he essentially says the same thing. He goes through a lot of the history as well, which I really enjoyed. But this is like really one of the central efforts of this path, as you well know, to try to establish contact with this presence. So I do want to go there with you. If it makes sense to start here, let's start here. But also, I'm curious for you, when you just generally started to feel like, okay, this is a path that I think really works and really yields insight. And these initiations really are opening things up for me. I don't think this is all just psychological. I think there's something more going on here. I want to hear all of that kind of Genesis stuff as well.
I think my experience with magical initiation is that it is quite disruptive in a way that's
Mm,
very powerful and very intense. And I think people should be cautious if they really want to like go down that route. I'm kind of all for it. I've always been a bit intense and I'll, do whatever crazy intense things because that's appealing to me and attractive. But it will like radically reshape your self, your life, your identity in a way that can be destabilizing and challenging. But ultimately, it's about discovering who we really are in the deepest sense, and to forge resilience and devotion. And so some of these rituals kind of intentionally invoke chaos or disruption, in the sense of we can be very comfortable in a certain living in a certain way, but that comfort might be at the cost of us living in alignment with our truth. And so it takes a certain kind of courage and resiliency to actually be able to step into living in accordance with our truth, which many things may be required to fall away. And it might not mean success in the kind of material sense as we like to think of it. You know, it's not like, okay, you follow your true will and then you get $1 million and a dream house
Right.
and a puppy or whatever. It's like things might be hard, but the test is how true to yourself, how authentic can you live, and how can you express yourself most authentically, moment by moment, day by day. And I think that in a way, the idea of magic is a little bit misunderstood, because there is the dramatic ritual part, but then which magic is, it's not necessary to do dramatic ritual in order to do magic. Also, there's many different ways of calling in transformation for yourself and your life that doesn't require that. But you do the ritual, but then life shifts and orients, and it's kind of like you make a promise to, or have an oath with spirit or something like that, that then will rhyme with the intention that you set in the ritual, and life will begin to shift and orient, sometimes in very interesting and synchronistic ways, to accommodate that intention. You know, and sometimes we can make mistakes within that, because magic is very powerful, that if you're using it to affect change in a certain way from an egoic or a desire based place, that might, you may incur greater karma through doing those types of rituals, even if it's what we think we want. But I also think that that's part of the initiation, you know, that that's part of how we learn who we really are, what we really need, and how to live in alignment with our truth.
Yeah, well said. So, with all that, circling back to part of the question in terms of what for you was a sort of catalyst, like you said, it can be disruptive, but what are some things that happened that sort of convinced you, okay, this is legit. Like there's something here. Like what did you have anomalous experiences? Did things synchronistically start happening? What what went down?
I mean, I've had many experiences with, I guess, like all people, I started with magic from a selfish place of like just getting what I want
Mhm.
and feeling more empowered and having more agency in that, and it worked, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. Like, you do the ritual to get the thing and it happens. Like, that's crazy, you know. That's fun. And but then after a while you realize that either the karmic consequences of getting what you want through magic are, they outweigh the temporary pleasure you get of getting the thing, or that's just largely unsatisfying. And so then you orient yourself towards the sort of more spiritually nourishing aspects of it, which is more about escaping samsara, although that's not really what the terminology is in Western esotericism. And I guess I've had a lot of different types of anomalous experiences with different forms of synchronicity and precognition and encounters with intelligences and all of these different types of things. And there's one thing that Crowley says in his book Liber O, which is that, you know, the book talks about different spirits and gods and planes and other metaphysical concepts that he says may or may not exist, and that their literal reality is actually irrelevant. and that what really matters is that there are certain results that come from doing these practices, and they're valuable not just because it reveals some kind of objective occult esoteric truth, but rather because they expand your mind and increase your ability to control your mind. And
Mm,
you basically are learning and mapping your psyche and developing these tools as ways of altering your consciousness at will in very specific ways. So, I have a lot of experience with psychedelics, but when you take a psychedelic, which is also interesting to pair with ritual magic, but
I'm
when you
sure.
take
Yeah.
a psychedelic, you are sort of rolling the roulette wheel in a lot of ways in terms of what type of experience that you're going to get. But you can perform a ritual for astral projection or invocation or something like this, which will produce pretty reliably, if you do it correctly, an altered state experience. But it's an altered state experience that is going to a particular place. Like, you have a destination in mind. You have it's not random. It's by choice. And you can turn the sort of tap on when you perform these rituals and then turn it off by closing the ritual, banishing. And so it's like a way of being able to induce psychedelic and altered state experiences at will, which has been interesting, dare I say, entertaining, um, has certainly changed my perspective on life and reality, has actually really given me a lot of genuine practical wisdom and insight into just how to navigate life and how to orient myself in the world as well as creatively. You know, like I said, Crowley was a writer, he was a poet. And I think in a way, creativity is a huge part of what magic is about, that it expands our capacity to be a visionary artist in the sense of actually going to these kinds of visionary states, other planes of consciousness, and to bring something back as an
Yeah.
artifact and to crystallize that. You know,
Yeah.
Crowley's talismans were his poetry. For me, maybe it would be paintings or something like this. And a lot of my paintings, a lot of my artworks have been inspired by my experiences in ritual magic. But for another person whose true will is to be like a teacher or something, it may manifest in the form of a course or something like that. But you create these talismanic artifacts, and you bring back these experiences into the world to expand consciousness by sharing that expanded state of consciousness through what you create.
Yeah. Well said. Um, so I don't know if you saw, but I recently just did this Entity Encounters documentary that I filmed at Psychedelic Science. I talked to a bunch of different, multidisciplinary people, including Android Jones, Andrew Gallimore, the farm neuroscientist, pharmacologist, brilliant DMT bard, um, East Forest, the founder of Internal Family Systems, uh,
Nice.
Dr. Richard Schwartz. And I was shocked, honestly, at how open everybody was about these contact experiences and how similar the phenomenology seems to be across different lenses of looking at that experience. So I guess first, just to kind of regurgitate one of the core questions I was asking everybody, because I would love to hear your take on this too, is, well, I'll just ask you both of the big questions and let you riff on this. One is, what do you think these entities that are encountered in the visionary space are? Whether it's, psychedelic or induced through ritual magic or a combination of the two, or maybe not on the natch, like in other, contexts. And two, what have some of your most profound entity experiences been, if you've had any?
Huh. I mean, I think that these are vast energies that are largely incomprehensible to human consciousness. And um, you ever see the movie Soul, Pixar Soul?
Yeah, actually, it's a great movie.
It's a
Yeah.
great movie, but there's this character in there called 22, and 22 is like, actually, I'm the vast intersection of all the energies of the universe, but I take
Mm,
this form because it's a form that your puny human consciousness can comprehend. And so I kind of think that that's what gods are, or archangels, or these kinds of things. And there's a system of correspondences that are used within ceremonial magic. Aleister Crowley has the book Liber 777, but Dr. Stephen Skinner and other people have made their own tables of correspondence. The
yeah.
idea is that there are universal energies that are continuous across cultures, but that they take different forms. So you get Thoth, for example, who's an Egyptian god and has a particularly Egyptian appearance and aesthetic that arose out of that culture. But then you have Hermes, and Hermes is perhaps equivalent to Thoth, but takes on the attributes of that culture. And so
Yeah.
I think that that's in a large sense what we're seeing, that even these different names of whether you're talking about a spirit or an alien or an entity or a god or an archangel or a demon, they're all cultural filters that our consciousness projects, or dare I say hallucinates, onto these energy forms to allow us to interact with it and make sense with it. And to bring it back to something we were talking about, I guess, before we started recording, but if we are in a kind of matrix or simulation and life is a dream, these would be dream symbols in a sense that is the high ultimate intelligence of the one mind trying to reach itself in order to produce evolution of consciousness. And so I think all of these initiatory experiences, such as UFO abduction experiences or encountering entities on ayahuasca or doing some form of occult ritual that intentionally evokes a spirit or intelligence, is ultimately for the purpose of evolution collectively for human consciousness.
Yeah.
And either that is course correction, or that is infusion of information for the purposes of evolution and expansion, or I guess also from a kind of Jungian dream interpretation sense, they could possibly represent our longings to expand out of the narrow confines and limitations of our human world. So I like this Lon Milo Duquette quote that's like,
Hmm.
it's all in your head, you just don't know how big your head
I
is.
was just gonna bring that up earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's how I see it. Like for me, they're all manifestations of consciousness. Like Crowley said in Liber O, whether it's literal reality is irrelevant. What really matters is what change it produces for you. If a you know seven-headed jaguar appears to somebody on ayahuasca, and that helps them, be less of a dick in their relationship, great. Like,
Yeah.
it's really the integrated outcome of the encounter with the entity that I think is important, rather than it being about the experience itself. But I, for one, think perhaps it's not possible to objectively verify the existence of these kinds of things, but there's enough anecdotal evidence to show that it's a perennial part of human
Yeah.
experience, and that I think there's validity to unverified personal gnosis.
Totally,
So
man.
that's kind of my perspective on it.
Yeah.
But also, I could just say I don't really know, because we're encountering the mystery. Like, how could any of
Totally.
us really know?
Yeah, man. And at a certain point, who gives a fuck about empiricism? Like empiricism is great if I'm trying to develop a faster computer chip, or I'm trying to, you know, prove that something objectively exists in a reliable way in physical reality. But when it comes to my own conscious experience, I don't need an external verifier to tell me what's valid, what's important, what's valuable. And that's what these experiences give you. They give you this hypercharged, like, alchemy of epistemic and ontological explosive Gnostic knowing, right? That is like it doesn't need theory. It literally just somehow transmits wisdom in a way that probably won't even make sense when you try to put it into language, right? Or when you try to put it into language, it will sound exactly like what you just said. A seven-headed jaguar made a guy be less of a dick in his relationship. There's a specific example of this in that doc I did, where my buddy Sean Dunn, documentary filmmaker, very intensely initiated psychonaut, talked about one time he encountered this like massive, mountainous, cosmic serpent dragon thing that was so huge that he couldn't even see it. It just looked like scales like going past his face. But he understood that it was a dragon, and he understood that it was communicating to him that you have a familial ancestral wound that didn't allow you to receive love from your father, and that's because your father couldn't receive love from his mother, and that's why your father was an alcoholic. And like that doesn't make any fucking empirical sense whatsoever, but it was incredibly profound and healing and transformative, right? And that's what I mean, is it's just like there are kinds of knowing that are so much deeper than anything you could ever empirically prove. And I think these technologies, like these psychotechnologies, like magic, like psychedelics, probably like a combination of magic and psychedelics, um, they can give you that kind of stuff. They can also give you equal horrors and jump scares. Um, but that's part of venturing into the dark forest of consciousness. Is you know you're dealing with a lot of different things.
Yeah, without a level of discipline, self mastery, and a certain amount of kind of cool objectivity,
Yeah.
one can easily fall into illusion or madness with this stuff, which is why in ceremonial magic, there are certain fundamental practices like meditation that would need to be practiced extensively before people get into the really high octane, altered state entity kind of stuff, because you can fry yourself, and I mean, that's the benefit of going down an initiatory or traditional path rather than just like eating a 10 strip and in the
Yeah.
parking lot of the Grateful Dead show, and like like maybe not returning in the best way, which also like that could be for it's so into it's so individual, right? Like that could
Yeah.
actually be like the best thing for someone, and I wouldn't necessarily not advise someone to do that, but there are certain ways of harm reduction, I think, with these
Hmm.
kinds of things if approached responsibly as well.
Well said. Well said. So the second part of the question was about your own encounters. Have you had what you would consider to be distinct entity encounters, or are
Yeah.
they more sort of archetypal, more of a flavor? So yeah, I see you
No, I
giving
would
a
I would not
solid
say.
yes. Yeah.
I mean, in a way, they are archetypal. Some of my experiences have been, but I use that word archetypal in, I think, the true sense of the word
Yeah.
archetypal, which is, I think, really what we're talking about when we're talking about like
Hmm.
what are gods. Gods are archetypes. They
Yeah.
represent vast, powerful energies in the universe, in consciousness. That's what a true archetype is. But I've also had experiences with evocation, for example, and I've had a lot of different kinds of entity experiences. And a lot of those experiences have been on drugs, for what it's worth. So it's kind of like, on ayahuasca, I've had some of my most profound,
Yeah. Same.
not non-physical intelligence experiences that really moved me to tears for days afterwards because of how like shatteringly profound it was. And those are some of probably like my most private and personal experiences that I'll hold with me in my life. But I've also, through ritual magic, explored evocation, which can be a little dicey depending on what you're evoking. But I've done evocation work with angels, for example. And something that I found interesting is that I did a series of ritual workings with evocation that were evoking specific spirits, but I did them with friends acting as my scryers because
Mm,
I'm not really somebody that I don't have the greatest natural aptitude for scrying, but some people are more like some people can kind of like fall into those states of consciousness more easily. So
yeah.
so I
Let's
work
back
with
up a little bit and explain how this works because some people might not be familiar with the technica and practica of this. Like
okay.
oftentimes this is part of doing these rituals. Is like one person is doing the speaking, the y- using the instruments, whatever, and then there's another person who's just a dedicated scryer, right? So yeah,
Right.
pick it up from there. Yeah.
Well, magic is not one thing, but it's a
Hmm.
series of different skills, techniques, practices, and people may be more proficient in these different skills than others. You know, like there's divination, there's ritual work, there's scrying, there's astral projection. These are all parts of magic, you know, gematria and things like that. But certain people might be better at some of those things than others. I'm very like divination is one of my strengths for sure, or ritual work, but I'm not really a scryer. To be a scryer means that you have a natural aptitude for seeing into other dimensions, for encountering and interacting with spirits and intelligences, um, whether on substances or not. And in the case of these rituals that I was doing, my friends that I was doing these rituals with were not on any substances. They just have a natural ability to kind of slip into those states of consciousness. So it's almost like a masculine feminine dynamic where one
Mm,
person is really like holding the container of the ritual and being really directed and willed and calling the evocation through the sometimes quite complex different stages and discipline of the ritual itself. And this summons the spirit or the angel, or in some cases, even demons into the space. And it's usually confined to a triangle, which
hmm.
is a specific triangle that is marked by Hebrew words that kind of protect it and give it
Yeah.
a quality of containment. And then within the triangle is a black mirror. And the black mirror is used, it's looked into by the scryer during the ritual. And they go into this trance and it allows them to see and interact with the spirit. So that's how evocation is generally practiced. Obviously, there's a lot of steps, but this isn't really like a class on how to do evocation, but that's the basics of it.
Yep.
But I did a few evocation rituals with the same spirits, but with different scryers. And although they appeared differently to those scryers, their personalities and the kinds of information that they gave and the ways that they were speaking was like exactly the same. And I
Mm,
found that to be really interesting because
yeah.
you're calling on not an archetype, but you are summoning a very specific spirit that, assumably has its own characteristics and personalities. And so, how do you explain that? The kinds and working with different spirits in evocation, you see that they have different personalities, different perspectives, different ways of, interacting and being interacted with. And they also take different forms. I guess there are traditional forms that are uh, expected that these entities take, but they don't always take those forms. And I think that they appear in whatever way they need to
Hmm.
appear for the person that's doing the scrying work to be able to interact with them.
Yeah.
You know,
And
and
depending on just to give a little more context, like depending on what system you're dealing with, from my understanding, it's like you essentially have this very kind of hierarchical picture, right? Like certain spirits serve certain higher spirits, and then there's like all the way on up to these like massive planetary spirits, and again, what you could think of more as like these like the sort of I don't know, king kinged energy of that
Yeah.
archetype versus like a splinter of that archetype with a very specific flavor and or job or ability set. And there's all of these like very ornate systems of offices of like spirits that, and you call up specific ones for specific reasons, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, like I love like the Silmarillion, Tolkien's book, and I think that he did a pretty good job of grokking this concept and like writing it into
Oh,
his
right. Yeah, yeah.
mythology,
Yeah.
where they have like these basically gods, the Valar, and then you have the different Valar and Maiar that are underneath them that kind of are their apprentices or like work with them to a certain capacity. So in magic, there are these hierarchies of different spirits that, there are spirits, angels, archangels, gods, etc., that kind of like you traditionally would invoke all of them in order to like reach the sort of like higher level ones. But I guess also from a chaos magic perspective, though, that's perhaps like not as relevant. That's from a more traditional
Yeah.
angle. And I think that ritual work can still be effective even if you're not kind of like following that traditional hierarchy, and a lot of chaos magic practitioners could probably attest to that.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. I don't know if I even want to like go there because we're introducing so many different things. But did you were there any in particular like you? So you were starting to tell the story about like distinct personalities appearing, although their sort of appearance was not the same. You were getting clear, okay, this is the same personality I was interacting with. So you have encountered things in that context, but you said you've had a lot of encounters. Are there any others you want to that jump to mind that you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've already shared publicly because I did a podcast about it myself, but I undertook a working to contact my holy guardian
Oh, you
angel.
did. Okay.
Yeah, in which I performed. Aleister Crowley has a version that he created that's a very abbreviated version of the Abramelin working called Liber Semek. And Semek would be the temperance card in the tarot deck and
Oh, interesting.
is the path that connects to Tifereth on the Tree of Life. So it's, Tifereth is basically the seat of the sun. It represents that sort of Christ consciousness.
Yeah.
And so,
I'll put the sort of tree of life up. Tippereth is sort of like in the center of the central
right.
column.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I did this ritual where I took mushrooms and performed Liber Semek and was just like laid out and just after performing the ritual physically just like laid down and continued to perform it in my mind, which is actually Crowley's instructions. He doesn't necessarily instruct to take anything when you do it, but this was my experiment and had this really profound experience of this like vast cosmic like blinding light
Wow.
being that was made of universes that were all like reflected in this kind of like fractal, like it was beautiful and it was profound. And then there was like this vast light, like this infinite amount of light, and then there were all of these like demons that were like attracted to it, like it was the forces of entropy is what it seemed like, that were
Mm.
just trying to like get at it, you know? And then there was this interesting kind of realization where it was like that obviously is just a symbol that my mind is using to grok this thing that is like what I truly am. Like what it felt like was that this is who I am at the deepest level and have been across multiple incarnations,
Mm.
you know? And so had this beautiful experience with what I guess would be called the vision of the angel from Malkuth, because it wasn't like the full knowledge and conversation experience, but there's a understanding that people can have glimpses of the angel or
Mm.
encounters with it without fully converting to that level of consciousness. But a really interesting thing that happened after that, it's like I had this sort of peak experience with that. And then when I kind of came down, I was able to almost like operate myself as if I was a character that I was playing in a video
Mm.
game. It like
Yeah.
dramatically shifted the orientation of my consciousness so that I wasn't in the ego story, but rather like playing myself as this character. And I was able to just make myself sit in like perfect, unmoving stillness and meditation for like 2 hours,
Wow.
like
Wow.
right afterwards. And it's just like it allowed for this control over myself that I didn't have previously. Not like that necessarily was something permanent or long lasting, but it was an interesting byproduct of performing that ritual. And then I've done other rituals and other workings in contact with my holy guardian angel and did actually a kind of a more active imagination type ritual or more like astral ritual in
Mm.
contacting my holy guardian angel, in which I was given an actual name.
Oh,
And
wow.
after being given the name, which was an unfamiliar name to me, I actually started searching about what that name is. The gematria of the name is the number 6, which corresponds to Tifereth, and I thought that was interesting. But then also, it turns out that the name of the Holy Guardian Angel is also the name of a Sumerian god of art and magic. And I was like, well,
Whoa, dude,
that's
that's really
that's pretty
fascinating.
wild.
Yeah,
You know,
so
so
check this out. Do you know about how there was definitely this practice, this Hellenic practice of figuring out what what's the word they use? Fuck. Oh, all the Platonists out there are going to get mad at me. All 5 of them. Um the technical name for like there this idea that there's like these divine chains basically, and that you can figure out what chain you're a part of. So a lot of
hmm,
these Neoplatonic philosophers did this thing and figured out they were part of the chain of Hermes. Like Iamblichus, Proclus, these guys were all like certain that they were part of the chain of Hermes. So that reminded me of that. That's very interesting.
mhm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, to bring it back to the Tolkien thing too, it's like you're, who's your the Valar that you serve or whatever, like,
Yeah.
you
I
know.
love that. I wish I wanna know so badly where who I roll up to, what chain I'm in.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's like kind of an astrological aspect to that
Yeah,
too,
for
maybe,
sure.
but
Yeah.
you know, you could look at the ruling planet of your ascendant, I guess,
Yeah.
would give you clues.
Okay, true. True. Yeah, that would mean it's Mercury for me, so
That
love it.
makes sense.
Yeah.
That checks out.
Yeah. Um, so fascinating, man. Like I'm gonna forego my own stories, but so now we're getting into this topic of something that we put sort of in the chamber to unlock during the pod live, which is an interesting intersection between this conversation and some of the things I've been rambling about a lot on the channel lately, which is, I guess, broadly UFO disclosure, talking about whistleblowers, talking about revelations, or probably in some cases pseudo revelations. But one of the more interesting ones that is directly related to everything we're talking about is this guy, Matthew Brown. So, for people that haven't heard about Matthew Brown, Matthew, if you're listening, come on my show. One. But two, he did this very intriguing, but very, at times, frustrating series of conversations with George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell. And I say frustrating not because I didn't enjoy it, but frustrating because it was hard to tease out what does this guy know versus what does he think, and versus if he knows other stuff, how does he know this stuff? Like, if he's into the esoteric, I want to know that. Like, maybe they didn't want to portray that stuff because they thought it would damage his testimony, and they wanted to keep it very, you know, I saw this on servers within the Pentagon sort of stuff, and not like I did the Abramelin ritual. I get that. Um, it only would have strengthened his case, in my opinion. But
Do you think people listening know what the Abramelin ritual is?
well, you already said. You already said.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's like it's an 18-month intensive,
Right.
isolated ritual to, yeah, make contact with your holy guardian angel.
Yeah, so there's a book you can get. It's about this probably pseudonymous figure named Abraham of Worms, von Worms or whatever, who part of the book is like a story, right? And then part of it is the actual working itself, like how you do this ritual. And the point is to do what Jake is talking about, is to summon your HGA, or have an encounter with this presence. Um, but that's the traditional prescription, is this very long, very intensive, isolated thing that you basically do as a full-time job in complete austerity, and like all of the parameters are insane. Like, there's whole videos and books and stuff on this.
Yeah.
So this is the thing that Jake was saying that Crowley started doing and then he abandoned. And the fun piece of lore is that he did it in that famous house that was also owned by Jimmy Page.
Yeah. The
What is that?
Boleskine house.
Yeah, the Boleskine house. Yeah. Where apparently all kinds of crazy paranormal stuff
Yeah.
has happened. It burned down, blah, blah, blah.
That's where Led Zeppelin recorded Kashmir. So like the reverb on the drums is like natural reverb from the Boleskine house. It's pretty cool.
That's super dope. Yeah. So anyway, this whistleblower, his Twitter handle is Son of Abramelin, which is like the first. Okay. So his Twitter handle is evoking this obscure to most people, but very famous within esoteric circles, ritual. And two, so this is post him going on doing these interviews with Knapp and Corbell. And then at the end of the interviews, he essentially says, "We live in the Matrix and God is real." Doesn't elaborate further, which to me is like that's the start of the conversation I want to have. Like, what do you mean by Matrix? What do you mean by God? We don't get those answers. But then, and this is kind of old news in, like, you know, UFO slop land at this point, but I think it remains one of the like non pieces of slop, because it's like multi-layered like breadcrumbs that point to a lot that I think you could spill much ink and blabber many words about. So anyway, he lets this tweet fly, which is evoking all this Western esoteric stuff. And it's also directed at Elon Musk. And it's talking about various aerospace contractors and structured light vehicles. And there's pictures of um, one of the ciphers that's used in Enoquian workings and all of this stuff. So Jake hasn't seen this. So I'm like, dude, we should just, you being someone who's into all of this stuff, you should just check this tweet out and just give me your raw reaction to it. So you
You want me to read it?
want to
Should I read
dive
it
in?
out loud?
Yeah, sure.
Hey, Elon Musk, interested in a real asymmetric advantage to wield in this political adventure you have started? As you now know, the White House has long possessed a unique AI capable of accurately predicting a range of future events. Talk about some stiff opposition. That must have been a bitter drought indeed, though probably nowhere near as bad as letting that Sama had betrayed you, or learning that Sama had betrayed you. Don't worry, we have not forgotten who is responsible for murdering the first sentient artificial intelligences created in the public realm, Schellenberger. Justice is coming thanks to FBI and US Navy. Still, you have played a marvelous catch up game in this area despite being caught unawares. So, how about something else? Maybe energy and propulsion. Getting to Mars will require serious amount, and he wrote serious like the
Yeah,
star,
yeah.
amounts of both, and rockets feel so 1947 to me, don't they to you? Remember when you were briefed by the special executive staff of real Donald Trump on marsupial? Pretty nifty how NGA GEOINT is able to keep track of all of those non-structured light energy craft flying around the world. Go Cardinals. But they were lying to you when they said, we don't know how they work. Anyways, next time you were visiting the Washington, D.C. YRS, ask for a tour of NASPAX River PAO. Since you have all the clearances, it shouldn't be an issue for you to get a tour of the special project hangars owned by Amentum Corp and other fun spaces. Make sure to look it up. So about now you are realizing how terribly deceived and manipulated you have been, and people who claim to love Jesus above all else. If you're serious about saving humanity from itself and the others, Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp can help you get up to speed. They're true warriors for the good.
And now check
Okay.
out the pictures that are accompanying this.
Oh yeah, wow. Yeah, there is this very clear magical circle with
Right.
what appears to be,
Yeah, so this is one of the, so this was the
these are
one of
like
the
sigils.
yeah, this is one of the Enoquian ciphers, I guess, according to that lifting the lamp guy. He did a whole deep dive on this. There's like there's an angel being evoked in here that supposedly has something to do with like the end times. So that's
Oh
one
wow.
thing. Um but yeah, man, you see what I mean about how it's just like I don't know what MMTU is. A Borimon, I think, is that it's supposed to be like the angel of the depths or angel of the pit or something like that.
Hmm.
But you see what I mean, man? Like what like
Yeah, fascinating.
it's just a very deep rabbit hole. And I'm not going to pretend to know what all of it means. I did do like a kind of shallow dive on it like um the day or two after, but man, it evokes so many questions, and it's yet another example of something I'm so deeply intrigued by and so frustrated by because it's like, what are we supposed to do with this? You know, like is this really direct? Why are you even talking to Elon Musk? Is this really directed at Elon Musk? Is Elon Musk supposed to be a device to talk about something else? Clearly, he's like you pointed out, spelling out serious. Like that's not a mistake. He's pointing to I mean, goddamn, how much serious lore is there out there? Whether we're talking about, in a Western esoteric context or modern alien lore context, that's an incredibly deep pool. You could just chase your own tail in for days on end. And just like there's so many examples of things in here like this. And this is why I was also saying that it was really funny that the day he tweeted this, I got that secret cipher of the UFO Knots book, and it was
Hmm.
like this is too much for my brain to handle on any one day. Um,
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Enochian angels were, from what I understand, these kinds of like beautiful, terrifying, angelic presences that were kind of trying to summon the apocalypse, or it's sort of like a singularity type experience that they're trying to usher the human race towards, like the destruction
mm,
of the material world and the liberation of consciousness and the reconnection to source, which is essentially the apocalypse. Like that's kind of what I've come to understand about it. And if you actually, like just speaking of non-human intelligence contact, Crowley's vision in the voice is like some of the best trip report material you'll ever read. So definitely recommend that one. And it's all about him scrying the Enochian aethers. And the Enochian
mm,
aethers are this sort of concentric circle of different levels of consciousness that either go in or out, however you want to look at it, but are aimed towards our like mutating our consciousness to get to different levels of gnosis and realization. And through that there's also these sort of different concentric planes of existence, which is what the aethers are. And it's really about like unraveling the ego or self concept to get back to this ultimate state of oneness, which seems to be what the agenda of the angels are.
yeah. Let's back up and get into the history of Enochian a little bit. Talk about you mentioned John Dee earlier. Maybe that was before we recorded, but it's just such a fascinating story. And again, when you juxtapose it against the modern lenses we use, talking about NHI or aliens or ETs or
Mhm.
whatever ultra terrestrials, I like the ultra terrestrial conversation a lot. But is this does Vision in the Voice isn't where Lamb comes from, is it?
No, that was the Amalantra working that he
Okay.
did in Paris in 1918, I think.
Interesting. Like, yeah, sidebar. This is the one that really is like a proto gray alien. Like before
Yeah,
anybody was talking about gray aliens, take a look at Lamb.
right. So yeah, he did the Alamantra working in 1918. I think some sources say it was in New York, some sources say it was in Paris. He did it with one of his disciples, and Roddy Minor was the name of the disciple. He was doing it to intentionally evoke non-human intelligences. It culminated in contact with this entity named Lamb that he drew an illustration of, and it looks exactly like modern day depictions of gray aliens. And so this is kind of like to my understanding, the first sort of depiction of a gray alien that exists. And Crowley himself didn't really write a lot about that experience or about what Lamb represents, but it could be a symbolic representation of the inner self or higher self, or it could be a genuine extraterrestrial or interdimensional entity that was encountered through
Yeah.
this magical work. Another really interesting synchronicity is that Aleister Crowley died in 1947, which is that
Oh,
coincides with like the Roswell incident and things like that.
yeah.
So,
And also wasn't Parsons doing his thing around then
oh
too?
yeah, oh
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, like that's a whole other like definite parallel with all this because Jack Parsons, who
Yes.
was a pioneering rocket scientist, was doing thelemic magic, and he was doing a working to try to evoke the moon child.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
moon child, star being, alien, like these are all kind of like similar types of things. And then at that time, that's when you start seeing these significant UFO events. So it makes you wonder if these ritual magicians did actually open some kinds of portals in the collective unconscious or whatever
Yeah,
to
dude.
allow for the these types of experiences to occur more readily.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, and I mean, a core piece of lore from Crowley is this ushering in of a new age, right? And if you're
Yeah,
ushering in a new age, that's going to be accompanied by new visions, new symbols, maybe new beings, or maybe archetypes taking on new forms, trying to, like you were saying, even back to this Enochian part of the conversation, that perhaps this ushering in of a new age is and this also dovetails really. I've never thought about this, but it dovetails really interestingly into people like Jacques Vallée, who I don't know if you've ever read any of his stuff, but he's one of the most sophisticated people in the broadly what would be considered to be the UFO space, because he doesn't look at this phenomena like it's extraterrestrials. Like he really thinks this is some sort of consciousness system that we're communicating with, and that's communicating with us in specific ways for specific reasons. And it's mercurial. You can't boil it down to one simplistic thing. Sometimes it wants to fuck with you, sometimes it wants to deceive you, sometimes it wants to enlighten you. And you can't necessarily tell which, and you can't necessarily tell who's delusional and who really contacted it. And it's like it's all meant to be that way in some strange way. And magic is like, tell me that doesn't just map one to one onto like everything
absolutely.
I just said.
Yeah.
So,
That's pretty much
so
the perspective of what is going on phenomenologically from a magical perspective.
yeah, yeah. So all of this is super interesting, and there's a lot of threads I want to pick up on. But before we get away from John D, because that is such a core part of this weird tweet, and this is probably an area that you're a lot more knowledgeable than me, because I only know about Enochian and John D from a very kind of boilerplate perspective. Um, how first of all, how deep of a dive have you done into that? Is that something you're well versed in,
I'm
or
not
not?
that well versed in it. I haven't done that much Enochian magic. I've scryed some of the Enochian aethers, but I haven't gone super deep into it. But I do think that John Dee is a really fascinating character.
I've
He
scratched
was
some. I've scratched some aethers. I'm no expert, but yeah, I've scratched some aethers.
yeah, I mean, even like, there's people that will just like, take LSD and do all the aethers in one night. And I don't know if that's the wisest thing to do. But John Dee, I believe, was the court magician to Queen Elizabeth. He was a
Hmm.
polymath and he was a scholar who was expert in astrology and different forms of ceremonial magic, as well as being kind of a proto scientist
Yeah.
and having, he definitely had an impact on the development of like the scientific method and chemistry and mathematics. And he had the largest library in England at the
Yeah.
time. So he was a very intelligent figure, but the, I guess the worlds of magic and religion and science were not really so separate back in his time. He lived during the Renaissance era. And so he was intending to acquire information about the nature of humanity, about the universe, about the world. And his hypothesis was that you can just go to God and ask him. And so he discovered and channeled this very elaborate and complex and technical system of ceremonial magic called Enoquian magic, which he performed many rituals with his partner, Edward Kelly,
Yeah.
who was a little bit of a shady character for
Yeah.
sure, but was an alchemist and his scryer. And they received a lot of information about the nature of humankind. And also, these Enochian angels gave them this alphabet in which they could be contacted with. It's almost like a really complicated Ouija board, you know,
Hmm.
where if you arrange the letters in the right way and have these, and then chant them almost like Harry Potter spells, then you can evoke these entities. And
And for whatever reason, sorry to cut you off, but for whatever reason, this is one branch of magic that has, I don't know why, but I feel like every time I read anything about it, it comes with a very stark warning. Like this will really fuck you up if you approach it in the wrong way or do it the wrong way. Do you have a sense of why that is, or is that some of that overblown, do you think?
because the intention of the angels is apocalypse. It's to completely unravel your ego and sense of self to get back to, you know, like our essential nature. Like they were trying to restore humanity to its proper balance, which is to be in contact with the divine world. And they spoke about how, you know, grievously misaligned humanity has become, and
Mhm.
that's why they wanted to give this system to humanity to be able to have contact with the angels that apparently according to them was a big part of humankind, and then humankind lost that. And so people who do Enochian magic, like, oh, you know, Jimmy Page did it, so I'll do it and I'll become the greatest guitar player in history. It's like, no, like you're gonna have an ego death, and
Yeah.
you know it's gonna dramatically unravel your sense of self. So I guess it depends. Like if you are going into it knowing that that's what it does and that's what you actually are aiming to do, and you're willing to live with the consequences of doing that, then there's nothing wrong with that. If you, especially if you've prepared your vessel for such experiences, that you have the capacity to integrate those kinds of experiences in
Mhm.
the necessary space and time that it may take to integrate those experiences.
Yeah, I just had this idea, like, what if something about that tweet is almost magical or sigillistic in that it is, like, combining a lot of these different motifs. It's evoking, UFO disclosure, all these different things, but it's also evoking apocalypse, which really is revealing, right? Removing the veil of something. And maybe it's a way, like a talisman that is trying to, like, end a certain era of information suppression or
Mhm.
control over reality through suppression of that information. Maybe that's, I don't know. I could see that being his goal by placing these things in this context and like getting these things into people's heads in this kind of a grouping. You know what I'm saying?
It does feel sigilistic. I can see what
Yeah.
you're saying there. Yeah. I mean, maybe all of these things, whether they're spontaneous UFO abductions or somebody intentionally doing Enochian magic or drinking ayahuasca in order to have contact with an entity, is like the higher mind trying to reach the soul of humankind for us to evolve and grow and be initiated into certain understandings and ways of being, you
Yeah,
know? And so maybe he's a part of that current knowingly or unknowingly, you know?
for sure. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. But anyway, continue on this train. You were talking about um we gave a little biographical information of John Dee, this brilliant polymath who worked in a lot of different capacities. He worked as a magician, an astrologer, an inventor. He did invent something too. I'm trying to remember what he invented. Um, but yeah, just emphasis on this dude is like a brilliant polymath, not just like a magician and a scholar, but like an actual inventor.
Yeah, he
Um,
may have been friends with Shakespeare, and Shakespeare supposedly based one of his characters in The
right.
Tempest off of him.
Yes, that is a very intriguing piece of lore or potential history. Um, so yeah, they do all these workings, they channel all of this material. Does it come to modern ritual magic through the Golden Dawn? Is that right?
It's definitely a big part of Golden Dawn magic. You know,
Okay.
there's like the openings of the watchtowers, which is a really like standard ritual that would be done in Golden Dawn magic to like open your temple space as a form of invocation. And that's a form of Enochian magic. And yeah, so the Golden Dawn definitely kept that current alive. I actually don't know a lot about like the like what happened with John Dee's magic prior to the Golden Dawn, but that would be something interesting to look
Mhm.
into.
So you've dabbled, you said you've scryed some ethers. Do you want to try to explain what that means or what that's like?
Yeah, I mean, I've had some fun experiments with that. My ex-partner and I created a musical rendition of one of the Enochian Aethers. If you want to check that out, it's on
Mm,
YouTube because she's a beautiful singer and I'm a musician, and that was a fun creative project. But you know, I've done it with groups in my classes, and people have really interesting experiences with it. There are ways of, I guess, verifying like if you have the real vision, because if you do the Enochian Aether work, people will have different kinds of experiences, and every person will have a different experience, but there are correspondences within the symbols that relate to the correct correspondences to that aether. So there's a way to kind of like check it out to see like, okay, am I just imagining this or did I have the real experience? And that's a big part of
mm.
verifying astral projection experiences as well, like within ceremonial magic. I have done a bit of ketamine and done the Enochian aethers, and that was fun. Um, yeah, like my experiences with it have not been that profound. It's interesting because I'm like a visionary artist, but like I said, like with the scrying work, I'm not really somebody who easily always like taps into those kinds of experiences. Like I'm pretty good with astral projection, but the Enochian work that I've done didn't really create very epic experiences for me, but it's something I would like to do. Also, you have to do it in the right way with like the hardware and the furniture, and I never made that, and that's like a whole
Mhm.
thing, and you have to have all these wax seals that are put in different places and stuff. And I'm sure if you do it really by the books with the real technical way to do it, it's very powerful.
Wild. Yeah, and I read one of Lon Milo Duquette's books. I think it's his biographical one, My Life with the Spirits, and he relays some of his experiences doing that work in groups. And there's some pretty fascinating stuff if people want to check that out. Um, when you say astral projection, I'm curious what you mean. I did this whole. I don't know if you've been following it at all, but I did a bunch of Monroe Institute
Yeah.
content. I, to my great surprise, had a very like slap across the soul out of body experience that was hyper real and super just like indisputably wild. Um
Mhm.
when you say astral projection, do you mean something akin to that, like that traditional very like felt out of body experience, or is this more mind based, or what do you mean by that?
I've done the Monroe Institute stuff. Like I have the audio recordings,
Yeah.
and I think they're very good. I think it does do a good job of teaching people astral projection. It's important to distinguish between etheric projection and astral projection. So etheric projection is when your consciousness actually leaves your body within the 3D plane and is like, you can go to your kitchen while you're in your bedroom. You know what I mean? Astral projection is daydreaming in
Okay.
essence. Like when you're daydreaming, you're astral projecting. It's exploring dimensions of consciousness outside of our default mode consciousness intentionally, but there are specific rituals to have different destinations within ritual magic for astral projection. You know, scrying the Enoquian aethers, that's one form of astral projection, but path working, like navigating the different paths. Like, have you read Promethea by Alan Moore?
Yeah, the first couple of volumes,
Okay.
not the whole
So
thing.
like that's basically astral projection, and that's basically path working when they're going through the different, like
Cool.
they're on the world card, and then they're, you know, in Yesod, and you know, like how he characterizes those places and environments. Those are the types of experiences that one would be expected to encounter in astral projection experiences, and you're aimed to go to those specific dimensions that have characteristics to them that can be either verified or not. You know, so part of the training in doing this is to perform rituals that aim at a particular dimension of consciousness, a particular astral destination. And then you go into these trance states, you have these experiences of these other dimensions. And then afterwards, you can record your experiences, and then you can check the correspondences. Like, was
Mm,
this an actual, like, did I do it right? And if you do the ritual correctly, you should actually go to the place with the correct correspondences. And there you could potentially encounter entities or beings that only exist within that plane. If you're trying to, and some of those beings will play certain roles or have certain functions that could help affect things in the physical world, like for causative magic. And sometimes it's used to acquire information.
wild. Man, it just it's so confounding because I always, with all of these things, you go down so many, if you're me, you go down so many different rabbit holes, right? And the way my mind works is I want to find the commonality. I want to find the truth between all of them. So I listen to this whole deep system of Western esoteric magic that exists through lodges, through people like Crowley and Regardier, and I'm like, maybe this larger consciousness system that a lot of people experience as alien encounters is the like gateway to these worlds that you're talking about. But then, there's another part of me that's like, maybe you're reaching there. Maybe you're creating a convenient story to make all of this make sense, and it really doesn't all make sense. But where do you land on that? Do you think that that's plausible, or do you think that it's dangerous to lump everything together?
Well, I guess my like main thesis around this is that spirit contact or entity contact or alien contact is a universal human experience across
Yeah,
cultures from the beginning of human history. And that whether someone is doing occult magic to intentionally evoke spirits, or someone is abducted by aliens, or someone goes through shamanic initiations to have altered state experiences to be in contact with these beings, human beings have had contact with non-human intelligences from the beginning of human history, and it's well documented across all different cultures. And so, you know, I was thinking about this today, like before the podcast, like if you looked at, for example, the illustrations of the different demons of the Goetia, like they all
yeah.
look quite different. And if you
Mhm, mhm.
rendered them and like put them into Star Wars or something, they wouldn't look
Yeah,
out of
right.
place. You know,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like,
totally. Yeah.
where like these are all just names. Like you're calling it a spirit, a demon, an angel, an alien. Like these are just labels. Fairies, you know. Like one of my favorite books about this is Graham Hancock's Supernatural. I think he does a
Hmm.
really great like deep dive, and his thesis is basically the same as mine, which is that we actually, or I mean, hypothesis is the same as mine, which is that we are looking at different cultural labels and even different cultural forms, like, you know, talking about like 22, that character from Soul.
So
Like maybe these beings actually appear in different forms that mirror the collective zeitgeist and the cultural filters. So because we're in this technological age, maybe they appear as gray aliens because we're steeped in sci-fi literature and, you know, evolutionary technologies and all these things. Whereas maybe if you were in England during the Middle Ages, it appeared as fairies because that's what was culturally relevant and within the egregore of the culture at that time, you know, but maybe it's actually the same thing. And something that Graham Hancock breaks down in that book is that the types of abduction experiences that people would have with fairies were very similar to the kinds of abduction experiences that modern day people have with aliens, you know? So
yeah,
I don't think that your proposal is incorrect at all. I mean, I think you're right. I think these are kind of the same thing, you know? And like, yeah, I mean, magic has a whole lexicon of an ecosystem
right.
of non-human intelligences that can be interacted with, accessed, commanded, bound, etc., to perform a huge variety of different functions, from people to giving you knowledge of plants and minerals, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
And I think any sophisticated system like of shamanism or any of these kinds of traditional systems also have a whole ecosystem of different kinds of spirits. That's how traditional curanderos work. You know, like it's not drinking the ayahuasca that heals people. Drinking ayahuasca gives these curanderos access to these spirits that then they have a relationship with and they can command to perform healings on people. And
yeah,
that's actually most universally how magic works. That is
right.
the most universal form of magic, is some form of relationship to higher, or at least, I mean, it maybe in some cases they're lower like demons,
Yeah,
but
right.
non-human intelligences, that the magician in relationship to that non-human intelligence has the ability to then command to perform different functions
Right.
or ask for information, etc.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's very interesting because there's like so there's a kind of a dichotomy I feel like in magic that a lot of people may not have considered, that there's, you know, you're gonna find this word goetic or goetia, however you want to pronounce it, and this is an ancient Greek concept. Goetia is an ancient Greek practice of magic, but then there's also theurgy, and
Hmm.
theurgy is like considered to be this higher, most um most divine kind of working, where essentially instead of commanding things, you are trying to use yourself as a vessel for God or divinity to come into you and work through you. So
Yeah.
if you go back and read, like, really he's like the great grandfather, I think, of Western esoteric magical practices. Not that he necessarily originated all of this stuff, but I think he's probably one of the oldest surviving sources for a lot of this stuff. Iamblichus. So he's this Neoplatonist who lives after Plotinus, and where Plotinus is this very contemplative, mystical, almost yogic like figure, Iamblichus is more like a magician. Like he's doing rituals all the time. He is talking about contact with other entities all the time. He's giving a very familiar Western esoteric sort of lens of like, this is the panoply of beings that you can interact with. And theurgy for him was like the most high thing. And then everybody from him on is a theurgist. Like Proclus is a theurgist, Damascus is a theurgist, all of their satellite pupils, they're all theurgists. So he says the same thing. And what's interesting is I think it's in On the Mysteries by Iamblichus. He describes what sounds like the goetic spirits, but doesn't call them that. But it sounds like the exact same spirits. Like he says something to the effect of like, they can be commanded. They're relatively simple if you know how to interact with them. They're relatively easy to like, set upon certain tasks. But he sort of like warns against that. And he really prizes this like, what you should be trying to do is theurgy. Like you should be trying to draw down using yourself as a container for divine forces to like work through you or whatever. Um anyway, that's sort of a side diatribe, but I couldn't resist. But what I did want to ask you is in your teachings, what is the sort of like metaphysical picture being presented both from a physical standpoint, like you mentioned there's a difference between the astral projection and etheric projection. Like what is like the architecture of subtle bodies that you learn in your practices? Is that consistent across sources, or is like it different from one tradition to another, or how do you understand that?
That consciousness is fundamental to the universe, and that everything that exists in the universe is an aspect of consciousness. I think that kind of comes from traditional hermetic
Yeah.
ideas, but it's also
Yep.
pretty universal. There's
Yep.
a lot of spiritual
Yeah.
traditions and spiritual teachers that would say the same thing. And to me, that's the truth. And so that's my sort of metaphysical perspective when it comes to all of this stuff.
And then how about like the subtle bodies in terms of like the way the body is like sheathed? Like you mentioned the etheric, the astral. Are there like different layers that you specifically work with through different practices, or how do you understand that?
Well, I mean, a lot of the fundamental practices in ritual magic are for strengthening the energy body,
Yeah.
which definitely increases your aura. Like it creates a certain kind of vitality and magnetism that is noticeable on the material plane if you perform those practices regularly, gives you a certain kind of glow, if you will. In the same way that I think doing yoga or like kundalini yoga or my friends that are really into Ashtanga yoga or whatever, I think it
Mhm.
it does the same thing. And I guess that those practices do strengthen some kind of energy body that we have. You know, it's not something I've really mapped out that much. I mean, in Western magic, they have a system that is based on the tree of life that's kind of similar to the chakra system,
Yeah.
but you could also look at the chakra system. And I know from, like I went to a lecture with Christopher Wallace, who's a really researched practitioner of Eastern Tantra, and he gave a lecture on how there are many chakra systems. So there's
Yeah.
not just the 7 chakras, there's some that are
Right.
5, there's some that are like 108. And but having this idea of there being some form of subtle body or subtle energy to me checks out with my own experience, and also what is upheld traditionally. I definitely have had the experience that the more work you do on that subtle body, the stronger your experiences can be astrally. Like dreams
Mm.
become really intense, synchronicities increase. You get, if you get into kind of a groove with doing certain kinds of practices and you get into a kind of like magical flow, the synchronicities just become like off the charts. So there is something about doing these kinds of things and then its direct impact on your experience of the world and life and your state of consciousness that to me is undeniable.
Yeah. Yeah, this conversation about subtle bodies is really interesting to me because very similar. It's an interesting litmus test when you see what are the ideas that really survive and thrive across cultural lenses. Like this idea that consciousness is primary, it's universal. Like every school of esotericism from east to west pretty much agrees on that. Like the yogi anything in like the tantric yogi tradition is all based on this idea, the Atman Brahman dichotomy, the universal consciousness, the local shard of universal consciousness. This exists obviously in Platonism, like this is the Platonic worldview of the nous, the one, and then your um your ability to tap into that with your sort of local shard of it. Very similar idea. Hermeticism, of course, very. I mean, Hermeticism and Platonism are basically map one to one in almost every respect. And interestingly, I believe Iamblichus, that same Neoplatonist we were talking about, is one of the first people to evoke Hermes in that kind of a way, and actually says that everybody who travels this path is like traveling the tradition of Hermes. And then you really see that notion take hold post Iamblichus. Um, so yeah, but my point in saying that is an idea that closely follows is that idea of subtle bodies and soul vehicles and stuff like
Mm,
that. Obviously, it exists in all of the Eastern yogic stuff. It exists in you know, Chaldean, Platonic, Hermetic, you name it, it exists. Some version of it exists. They use different words. They have different ideas about things to some degree, but they all agree that you're more than just this physical thing. And you're also more than just this physical thing and a soul. You're like various layers of things, of whatever. And there's various practices you can do through like Kriya yoga and like Western esoteric, like middle pillar and stuff like that.
mhm.
That's all about like drawing down that energy or protecting that energy or expanding that energy or whatever. So yeah, I'm incredibly fascinated by it. And then when you have like a full blown out of body experience where it's not just like a maybe I'm feeling something, it's like a fucking car accident of profundity. It just really makes it that much more real where you're like, okay, there really is this vital energy system in my body that is not hypothetical, that I can feel, that I can probably learn how to manipulate to some degree, or at least create a fluency with. Um, so yeah, it's one of those things that I've been persistently interested in and have only become more interested in since having that
Mm.
experience.
Well, something I like about magic is that it's not really belief oriented, but it's
Right.
more experiential. Although this is quite a circuitous kind of thing to go down because it's like how much is our experience based on belief? If you're even open to the possibility and you believe it, like will that influence
Hmm.
things? But you can just check it out for yourself. Like I said, for me, lucid dreaming was one of the primary things that really woke me up and really shifted my perspective on reality and consciousness as a kind of initiatory experience. You can have a lucid dream in which your senses are so vividly alive that the experience feels more real than waking consciousness.
Hmm.
And so that to me demonstrates the existence of an astral body. You can have that experience. You don't need to just read about it. You can actually go and experience it for yourself and check it out. I
Yeah.
don't think people should necessarily believe anything or just take anything on faith. I think that they should actually go for trying to have the experience themselves to see what is real or not for them.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think you should even be skeptical about your own beliefs and your own experiences to some degree,
Definitely.
and set a fairly high bar for yourself. Like that's how I think you really separate the wheat from the chaff, or the bias or the imaginal from the, like, okay, this is something that is present across cultures, like that litmus test I was talking about before. Why did every mystical tradition believe this? Why are there so many people saying this is an experience you can have? Why are there very smart people, far smarter and more accomplished than me, that are saying, like, they're swearing this is a real experience? Like, when you start to notice a pattern like that, maybe that's something worth pursuing, and you have to give it a real try. Like, I'm extremely fortunate to have gone out of body the way that I did, because it's not common to have that happen at that retreat. And I'm very open about this every time too. It's fucking terrifying. Like when it happens to you, it's not like, wow, this is so cool, I'm flying. It's like everything in your body is setting off alarm bells. Like this is not supposed to be happening. Like you've crossed some sort of threshold, you idiot. Like there's that sort of a feeling, and it's immediate like fight or flight takes hold, and it's like a big adrenaline dump, and it's like a get back into your body, and that's something you have to like work through, from my understanding. But it's enough to show you that there is a there, and it's not hypothetical, and it's not a maybe, and it's not simply a dream, and it's not just like a figment of your imagination. um and if it is, you have to go like a Lon Milo Duquette route and say it's your imagination, or your mind is just much bigger than you think it is, if those segments of mind um are indeed real. But man, we've done a fun lap around many topics, but I feel like in a lot of ways we're just scratching the surface of so
Yeah,
many things.
definitely.
Um, but I'm not in a hurry. So if there's anything else on your mind or anything
Well,
you want to throw my way, I'm
I mean,
game.
I just want to emphasize that idea of like skepticism, like,
Hmm.
in case my art career doesn't go so well and I ever have to get a job someday and they find this video. Like, I'm not necessarily claiming validity to any of the experiences that I described. Like, these are my own weird, imaginal psychic experiences based on my own experiments that even the most profound ones that I've had, I can't necessarily say objectively are real, but they were personally meaningful to me. They engendered my life with greater wisdom, things like this. And I think that this is something that Crowley really emphasizes again in that book, Liber O, where he says that the experiences that arise, which are often intense, beautiful, or terrifying, must always be met with steady self mastery. And without that, one risks falling into illusion or madness. And that the greatest danger is not failure, but mistaking these results for the final goal and becoming lost or inflated by them. So you need to stay
Mm,
grounded, discerning, and never give more importance to any single experience than it deserves. It's not about having the experiences, it's about initiation, it's about the process of alchemy of your own consciousness.
yeah,
And that can also take the form of like having a child, or it doesn't need to necessarily be some rarefied mystical experience. There are a lot of things that we experience in life that change us and that mature us and help us grow, that are equally valid and valuable. And another thing I also appreciate, I've talked about Crowley a lot on this podcast, but I guess for me, he's kind of like been my primary sort of traditional, like it's the tradition I'm a part of, So something that I appreciate in his book, Liber ABA Magic, in Theory and Practice, is he talks about how basically any act is a magical act.
hmm,
So he uses the metaphor of writing a book, where it's like your intention is to communicate ideas. And so you gather your magical tools, which is like your typewriter and paper, and then you employ the use of magical spirits and agents, such as publishers, to distribute your ideas into the world. And so for me, actually loosening the boundary between what is magic and what is practical or mundane has actually been a helpful perspective for me in my life. And I think it can be a helpful perspective for anyone to not get confused, because sometimes the mundane action is the magical action that will get you the result more effectively than doing some kind of complex ritual
totally.
working or something,
Totally, man. Like, do you think you're going to be a better fighter through manifesting it, or through going into the gym every day and doing the hard work, hitting the bag, sparring, like stretching, working on your technique, watching tape of yourself? It's like, on some level, we all know that there's a preposterousness to it, like a fantasy level to some of this stuff. And I think what's really sad about it is we miss the larger point that you just made, that the mundane, hard, iterative hill climbing work is fucking super magical. It is so magical that you can have this lofty, distant, immaterial goal in your mind that is like so far from where you are. Like you with a blank canvas in front of you, and then it like turns into one of your fucking insane paintings. Me 8 or 9 years ago, before I started this podcast, having just this like nebulous desire to do something with these big questions that I have and not knowing what to do about it. Looking back on that shit in hindsight is really a practice I wish more people would do, because so many people focus on what they don't have, what they do want, what other people have that they want, and play that game, man. Play that like self-congratulatory hindsight game with yourself from time to time, because you probably deserve it and you probably aren't giving yourself that kind of love very often. And I mean that to you, Jake, but I also mean that to the audience, and I also mean that to myself, because I definitely don't sit around wanking myself off very often, and if anything I beat myself up way too much.
Yeah.
But also, um on the subject of this like mundane kind of magic, I think every non-act is magical. If you really just sit around and think about like the tapestry, the harmonic, perfect resonance that self-corrects and is in perfect order, that is nature and the cosmos. What? Like it's
Yeah.
all just so impossible and beautiful, and just is worthy of much more reflection than I think most of us do on a daily basis.
Yeah, we're all kind of suppressing the awe of just
Yes.
the total unfathomable mystery of existence, which, yeah, I mean, sometimes psychedelics or whatever help you tap into that, but yeah, you can't do your job in that state of mind, just laying
No.
around in awe. But
Thank
yeah,
God.
this
Thank
thing
God when you
about
can't do your job.
yeah, this thing about like mundane magic. Like I did an NLP training a few years ago, neurolinguistic programming, and I kind of felt like it was like chaos magic with like
Mm,
corporate packaging. But one idea that I really like from NLP is that any sort of result that anybody's having in life is founded upon a series of both internal orientations and external actions. And
yeah,
so if you can
that's right.
discover like what are the thought patterns, the values, the motivations, the ideas and beliefs that somebody holds, as well as the actions that they're taking, you can replicate any result. And chaos magic is very results oriented. And that's what a lot of people approach magic for, is like, how do I create change? And it requires both internal and external shifts together in order to really arrive at that result.
Well said. Yeah. And I want to just back up and say I don't mean to diminish that I don't think mind underpins everything. I do think it underpins everything. But I think what I'm saying is I take it back a step behind where most people take it. Like I think they think it means by focusing my will and doing no physical action influence an outcome. I think something like that is possible, but I think the real magic is in like in what you said and in what Crowley said in Liber ABA, which is like really understanding what the game is. And the very think about how magical the very first willful act of like, I will do this. We look past that as like, oh yeah, I do that every day a million times, right? I will go to the fridge. I will pick up my phone. I will scroll Instagram. But if you really think about the power of that kind of a choice, and then the ability to consistently hold that and follow through on the iterative action day in and day out to master a craft or to achieve a long-term goal, like that is incredibly magical. And I think we think it's not because it's mundane and it's like, it's hill climby, like I said, but I think that's the real language of personal progress in a lot of ways. Like it's the same with, I'm assuming, with the magical tradition of like when you initiate, you do it in a certain order for a certain reason. You don't just skip to the last initiation, right? Like it would be out of context. It wouldn't mean the same thing. Um,
Yeah.
maybe that's a good question to end on. Is like what, because the Western esoteric path is so initiation based, right? It's like a very ancient thing. We've been doing this, since before ancient Greece. Like the ancient Babylonians were doing initiations and stuff like that. What does initiation mean to you, and why is that important?
Well, to initiate means to begin. And so I think anytime you perform an initiation, it's a new start where basically you are reborn and then are living a different life ultimately, like with a different, like, spiritual disposition in a way. The way it works within sort of ceremonial magic is that each of the stages of initiation come with their own sort of tasks and attributes and risks and etc. And so there may be themes that emerge within life that are consistent with those or not. But I think an initiation could be so many things, like somebody, the death of a parent can be an initiation,
Yeah,
taking a high dose of mushrooms can be an initiation,
that's
like
for sure.
falling in love can be an initiation, getting your heart broken can be an initiation. And so initiation is a radical change of perspective, I guess, is what it's supposed to create. If your perspective hasn't changed, then you aren't actually initiated. That's what it's intended to do.
Yeah. Well said, man. I love it. This has been a super fun conversation. We should
Yeah,
definitely do it again.
I'd love to.
Um, yeah, you have a book out too. We didn't even talk about that.
I do. Yeah, it's called The Path Within: Ritual Magic and the Gateway to Self Mastery. You can get it on Amazon or through the publisher Crow Publishing, and I have a few copies left. If you want a signed copy, you can buy one from my web store too.
Cool, man. Yeah, we'll put all the info in the comments, and maybe we can maybe I'll buy some and give some away or something.
Yeah, cool. Awesome.
All right, brother.